We all know that many of Sunderland's finest buildings have been lost, including the town hall. This makes our surviving architectural treasures all the more precious. This video traces the development of Sunderland architecture by examining the evolution of architectural style. Styles were not simply fashions in which to dress buildings, but complex semiotic systems that drew on centuries of architectural history and conveyed meaning through shared cultural knowledge. In other words, this video will explore the meaning behind Sunderland's buildings, asking why specific styles were adopted and what they were intended to convey. Sunderland architecture grew in sophistication from the mid-19th century, a development we can trace by gauging the progress of the classical style, also known as classicism. Classical architecture developed in ancient Greece in the 5th century BC, around 2,500 years ago, and came to represent the ideals of Western civilization. A notable example is the Temple of Hephaestus in Athens, which is actually the building upon which Pencha Monument is said to be based. The classical style of architecture is essentially a logical system of building. Typically, buildings stand upon a plinth and have vertical columns supporting a horizontal beam called an entablature. This, of course, holds up the roof. And another key feature is a triangular form called a pediment, which is essentially a decorative gable. The columns in classical architecture occur in 3 degrees of richness known as the classical order. They vary in proportion, but their main difference lies in the capital or head of the column. The simplest of the classical orders is the Doric, which has a plain and simple capital, as you can see. Next is the Ionic order, which has scrolled forms at the head of the column, said sometimes to be inspired by the horns of a ram. And finally, the richest of the 3 original classical orders is the Corinthian, which has an elaborately carved capital inspired by the leaves of the acanthus plant. The finest classical building in Sunderland is Monk Wearmouth Station of 1848. This was built by the infamous railway king George Hudson following his election as MP for Sunderland. He commissioned the town's most respected builder-architect to design it, a man named Thomas Moore. I say builder-architect because at this time Sunderland had no professionally trained architects, only builders who were able to do some designing. That does not suggest that this would be a very sophisticated building, but in fact it is a highly informed and elegant composition. At the centre is a portico formed of columns, entablature and triangular pediment we've already examined, and this forms a grand entrance to the building. The central block is flanked by symmetrical wings to politely screen the railway platform. The result is perhaps the most elegant railway station in the country. Sunderland's early efforts at classical design had been fairly crude, but Monk Wearmouth Station was a sophisticated example informed by antiquarian study. The Sunderland Herald reported that the design was inspired by a genuine ancient Greek building called the Temple of Artemis Agrotera, which lay just outside of Athens. This ancient structure was best known from illustrations published in a book called The Antiquities of Athens by James Stewart and Nicholas Rivett, published in 1762. Scholarly publications like this played a key role in disseminating architectural styles in this era. The portico at Monk Wearmouth is a facsimile of that illustrated by Stewart and Rivett, while the Ionic capitals of the columns reproduce the details precisely, including a graceful swag or curved form between the scrolling volutes at either end and a series of overloss or egg-shaped mouldings just below the curved form. We can see that Thomas Moore has not reproduced the decorative frieze that is depicted in the image on the right, nor has he fluted the columns as they are seen here on the left. So he has simplified the design, but by his own testimony, he was inspired by this specific building of ancient Greece. A heroic expression of classicism was Hutchinson's buildings on High Street. This was built by the timber merchant Ralph Hutchinson as a commercial venture with shops on the ground floor and residences above, all generating rent. The architect was George Andrew Middlemas, who was a powerful figure in Victorian Sunderland. He owned a brickworks, which made him wealthy, and he served as a Tory councillor, which gave him political influence. He built much of Sunderland's middle-class terraced housing. The elevations of Hutchinson's building are divided by a mighty drum, which provides a graceful way of turning the corner. In this respect, the building was probably inspired by the Central Exchange in Newcastle. This vision of classical splendour was achieved with high-quality stone from the Craigleith and Binney quarries in Scotland, both of which had produced stone for the building of Edinburgh's classical New Town. The building signalled the march of improvement in Sunderland, according to the Sunderland Herald. The architect, Middlemas, took care to have his name inscribed on the entablature, as we can see here. Unfortunately, the eastern part of the building was damaged in a catastrophic fire in 1898 and was subsequently rebuilt by Joseph Potts and Son to a different design. This image shows the building's original appearance with a continuous entablature sweeping around the building and a colonnade of columns dominating the facade that faces High Street. In the 1870s, the banking firm of Woods and Co. launched a visionary scheme to build a vast complex of buildings on Fawcett Street. These would include a subscription library, offices and shops, and the banking firm itself would have occupied rooms in the northernmost pavilion, which we can see to the right of this image. The well-known Newcastle architect Robert James Johnson supplied the designs, and this is a rare image showing what he envisaged, a parade of uniform classical grandeur. Had it been built, it would have elevated Sunderland's architecture to a high level. Unfortunately, local businesses rejected the designs and hired their own architects as they developed Fawcett Street. So the southern wing was never built. The library has been obscured by a blank modern facade. As a result, the existing building is only a glimpse of what could have been achieved. Nevertheless, it remains a dignified addition to the architecture of Sunderland. By the mid-19th century, the classical style nationally was being challenged by a rival. The Gothic style of architecture emerged in the Middle Ages. Inspired by nature, by God's creation, it was used primarily for churches and cathedrals. By the 1860s, however, the style was being used even for commercial and public buildings. George Gordon Hoskins of Darlington was a major exponent of this secularized form of Gothic. He designed three major buildings in Sunderland, beginning with the head office of Sunderland Gas Company on Fawcett Street. Specifically, this is an example of High Victorian Gothic, which flourished between the 1850s and 1870s. This form of Gothic architecture was more suitable for urban buildings because it used brick rather than stone, and brick was resistant to atmospheric pollution. The rain washes it clean. The inspiration for High Victorian Gothic architecture came primarily from the Gothic buildings of northern Italy. The brilliant Victorian art critic John Ruskin had celebrated the architecture of northern Italy in his influential book The Stones of Venice, which was published between 1851 and 1853. High Victorian Gothic was characterised by angular forms and polychrome surfaces, which were achieved through the use of multicoloured building materials, such as brick and stone, and this was all inspired by the architecture of Venice. This combination of brick and stone, often laid in horizontal bands, meant that the style was often nicknamed the Battenberg style or the Streaky Bacon style. Returning to Sunderland, the head office of the gas company has been altered over the years, removing some of the brick and stonework to make way for modern shop windows. But this photograph showed how it looked originally, again directly inspired by the architecture of Venice. In my research, I discovered that Hoskins also designed the furniture to be used within the building, as we can see from this image. Hoskins' brother, Walter Hamlet Hoskins, was a director of the North of England School Furnishing Company, and it's likely that this company manufactured the furniture for the building. Another major building by George Gordon Hoskins was the Backhouse Bank on High Street between the junctions with Norfolk Street and West Sunnyside. This was an excellent design, revealing Victorian architects' skill in adapting the Gothic style to modern building types. Unfortunately, this building has mostly been demolished, although the low range at the rear still survives. Fortunately, we have this image from an architectural journal to show how it looked originally. Most of the stone came from Penshire, so it was the same stone used for Penshire Monument. It was dressed with Dunhouse stone from Cleetham near Darlington, which Hoskins used frequently. The building was crowned with 3 gables, each bearing emblems of the Backhouse family. This was an era when businesses were recognising the value of distinctive corporate identities. Like the gas company office, this building had a projecting oriel window at the centre of the main facade. Inside, the banking hall was divided by columns of red granite. The floor was lined with encaustic tiles made by Moore and Co. from the Ironbridge Gorge in Shropshire. The woodwork was of oak and Spanish mahogany, and at the east and west ends were fireplaces of black marble relieved with Egyptian green and serpentine marbles. Hoskins' third and final building in Sunderland was the notorious Victoria Hall and Temperance Institute in Toward Road. This large assembly hall was built by a temperance committee chaired by the wealthy Quaker Edward Backhouse. In 1866, Hoskins designed a large Gothic building with a public hall to seat 2,500 people, a lecture theatre for 600, and a refreshment room and various committee rooms. This original design featured a tower and spire. To build it, the plan was to raise £12,000 by selling £1 shares in the company. However, the proposed building was deemed too expensive, and Hoskins was asked to revise his plans to enable the southern part, containing the public hall, to be built at a cost of £7,000, with the northern part to be built once further shares had been raised. These images show the building as originally constructed. It was built of brick with dressings of sandstone, and the north face was left blank to allow for expansion at a later date. Tragically, the Victoria Hall was the site of a disaster in 1883 when 183 children were crushed and suffocated in a rush to get prizes at a children's show. This was largely due to a design flaw. The doors of the auditorium only opened inwards. The disaster resulted in new legislation demanding outward opening exits for all such places of entertainment, and Hoskins was forced to defend himself in the building press. I discovered that the disaster also influenced Hoskins' design for Middlesbrough Town Hall. He added an ad hoc porch to provide additional exits. This disrupted his original design and has a very awkward effect, but it reflects the anxiety engendered by the disaster. Following the Victoria Hall tragedy, Sunderland Corporation acquired the building and commissioned John Eltringham to extend it in a complementary style. Known as Edward Hall, the extension opened in 1906. At the northern end stood a polygonal tower and spire. Eltringham also built a square tower at the southern end to balance the composition. However, the entire building was destroyed by a German parachute mine in 1941. Sunderland's most inventive architect was Frank Cause. He was born on the Isle of Wight, but came to Sunderland to work as managing clerk for the local firm Joseph Potts and Son. His first Sunderland design was the Pottery Buildings in High Street East. Built in 1868, these were funded by the Backhouse family as a community centre for the East End. They were named after a pottery that had occupied the site previously. Cause also designed Sunderland's most exotic building, the Elephant Tea House on Fawcett Street. Built by a grocer named Grimshaw, this Orientalist fantasy was designed in a style Cause described as Hindu Gothic. The design synthesizes the Italian Gothic we've already mentioned with Oriental forms from the Middle and Far East. The corner turret is crowned by an Asian pagoda, and extraordinary elephant gargoyles rear their trunks beneath the gables. Ingeniously, the elephants carry tea chests on their backs, indicating that the building sold exotic wares from the East. Its design reflects the fact that Britain had a global empire during the 19th century, which gave it access to parts of the world it considered exotic. Today, we might consider its design a form of cultural appropriation, as defined by post-colonial scholars such as Edward Said in his influential book Orientalism. Nevertheless, the vibrant facade is executed in red brick and terracotta made by the firm of Dalton and Co. of Lambeth. In fact, the design strongly recalls Dalton's own pottery buildings, which were built at around the same time. Both buildings were loaded with architectural ceramics to showcase the firm's products. This is a rare photograph showing a model of the elephants at the Dalton and Co. Pottery Works at Lambeth. Intriguingly, Cause's personal sketchbook features a fantastical scheme for a Middle Eastern style bazaar and exchange on Fawcett Street. The Elephant Tea House would have been repeated at each corner. The centerpiece was an Islamic style pavilion with onion domes and turrets resembling the minarets of an Ottoman mosque. Unfortunately, the site never became available, so this fanciful scheme failed to materialise. Had it been built, it would have given Sunderland the most extraordinary town centre in the country. Cores did produce two buildings for the draper Alexander Corder and Co. on Fawcett Street. Both have a fierce red colour achieved by the use of brick and terracotta, made by J. C. Edwards of Rwybon in North Wales. Corder House is a fusion of Gothic, Flemish and Moorish elements, a bizarre hybrid that few architects would have attempted. The facade is enriched with imaginative detail, including birds in flight, lettering and heraldic shields. We can see some of the details here, including a shield bearing the initials AC for Alexander Corder. And here, Cores took time to place his own name on this shield or cartouche, as well as the names of the terracotta manufacturers and the contractors David and John Rankin. Next door, Sydenham House was equally unorthodox. Cores kept his own office here, which suggests that he was particularly proud of the design. The name of the building is written across this scrolling Dutch gable above a griffin bearing a shield and Gothic tracery in the window. A craze for Japanese art and design swept Britain, Europe and North America in the 1860s, prompted primarily by the International Exhibition of 1862, which was the first time that Japan was given its own court within an international exhibition. Capitalizing on this trend, the enterprising Corder opened a Japanese extravaganza called the Mikado Bazaar inside Corder House. This sold Japanese wares such as fans, parasols and screens. Altogether, these buildings reflect the eclecticism of Victorian culture in an era when Britain was the centre of a global empire. The architecture of the late Victorian period reveals a desire to abandon the rigidities of the classical and Gothic styles we've examined so far. Architects began to make free use of Italian and French Renaissance styles, breaking with academic tradition. Victorian architects were faced with the challenge of designing the new building types required by an industrial capitalist society. Typically, they did this by adapting historical models. When it came to designing banks, the closest models were the palazzi or town palaces of the Italian Renaissance. These had public offices on the ground floor in which to transact business and private rooms for the family above. This model enabled architects to combine public banking halls with private offices for managers, all enclosed behind a dignified facade. Semiotically, the allusion to powerful dynasties such as the Medici had appropriate connotations for these palaces of Victorian capitalism. The best example in Sunderland is the National Provincial Bank on High Street. This was designed by John Gibson, an architect of national standing, because he was the official architect to the National Provincial Bank, and he designed branches for them throughout the country. Additionally, he had trained under Sir Charles Barry, who was the leading exponent of the Italian palazzo style. This is an image of Gibson, again an architect of national standing, who worked in Sunderland due to the fact that he was the official architect to the company that was building a branch network at this time. The most important development was the building of Sunderland Town Hall. To obtain designs, a competition was held in 1886, and the great Victorian architect Alfred Waterhouse was appointed to judge it. The winning design was submitted by Brightwen Binion of Ipswich. Funnily enough, he had trained under Waterhouse and, like him, was a Quaker. For these reasons, the competition was dogged with accusations of corruption. It was meant to be an anonymous competition, but it's highly likely that Waterhouse would have recognised Binion's drawing style and indeed handwriting. The building contract was let to E. H. and S. Allison of Sunderland for £25,120, with John Robinson as Clerk of Works. Construction was overseen by the local architects John and Thomas Tillman, because Binion was based in Ipswich, and completed at a cost of £27,000. Furnishings and fittings brought the total to around £50,000. If we examine the design, the base was rusticated. This term refers to various techniques of shaping the stone blocks to emphasize them, to make them stand out. And this evokes the rugged power of hypothetical rustic buildings, hence the name. Rustication was widely used in commercial and public buildings, imparting a sense of strength and impregnability. Rising from this powerful base, the facades were designed in an eclectic style, combining bold classical forms, such as the columns and entablatures, with rich Renaissance details, such as the round-headed arches between the columns. The corners were expressed as pavilions, emphasized visually, and braced with giant columns of the Corinthian order. French influence can be seen in the climactic French pavilion roofs, which terminate the pavilions. These are loosely known as mansard roofs, in reference to the French Renaissance architect François Mansart, who used them frequently. The centerpiece was a prominent clock tower. The clock itself was made by the renowned firm of William Potts and Son of Leeds. The bells were supplied by John Wayner. Many Victorian town halls had towers. but most of these were built for visual impact and had no functional justification. Sunderland Town Hall was different. The building was ventilated by means of extraction flues, which were carried into a shaft in the tower. So the tower was vital for ventilating the building. The heating and ventilation systems were supplied by Frank Ashwell of Leicester. The entire building was faced with sandstone from the Prudham quarry near Hexham in Northumberland. The same stone was used for many of the region's public, commercial and ecclesiastical buildings. If we examine the plan, we can see that the building was rectangular with two quadrangles at the centre to illuminate the internal offices. A vestibule led to the grand stair hall, which swept up to the first floor. The rest of the ground floor was occupied by offices for borough officials. On the first floor was a grand reception room for public functions, a mayor's parlour and a council chamber. Using these plans, we can break down the anatomy of the town hall to see what the individual parts were used for. This is the main entrance with brackets supporting a balcony for electioneering. Significantly, Binyon reproduced this composition at Swindon Town Hall, which he completed in 1891, thus preserving a tiny vestige of Sunderland Town Hall's original design in built form. The entrance hall and main staircase were worked in Dennick stone from Northumberland, with columns of polished red granite and extensive tile work. These spaces formed a spectacular scenographic procession that swept visiting dignitaries up to the lavish council chamber. This is the council chamber, which had desks arranged in a horseshoe formation as recommended by experts on Victorian town hall design. Unfortunately, the town hall was soon found to be too small. Various alternative uses were suggested, but these were rejected by the then Tory council, apparently eager to claim a £100,000 redevelopment grant. The town hall was demolished in 1971, an ignominious fate for the building that had embodied Sunderland's civic pride. The major example in Sunderland, and one of the finest examples in the country, is the Dun Cow, a fine Edwardian gin palace designed by the Newcastle practice Simpson, Lawson and Rain, whose lead practitioner was Benjamin Ferdinand Simpson. He is best known for Emerson Chambers in Newcastle. He conjured an eye-catching corner pub that would lure customers in with its interiors of sparkling glass and lustrous wood. The elevations have the plasticity typical of the Baroque style and terminate with decorous Dutch gables. The interior features two main rooms divided by an undulating wooden screen with stained glass panels. A decorative screen behind the bar fuses Oriental with Gothic motifs, recalling the work of Frank Cause. In 1903, Simpson remodelled the Half Moon Inn in High Street East. This had been adapted from a private house. Simpson was hired to transform it into a more appealing venue. His solution was to aggrandise the facade with lavish tile work. Again in the Edwardian Baroque style, but showing an influence of the continental Art Nouveau style. I would now like to explore the work of a lesser known architect. Clare Arnold Clayton Greene was born in London. However, he came to the northeast and trained under Benjamin Simpson. He designed St Gabriel's Church, one of Sunderland's finest 20th century buildings. This was designed in a late Gothic style of the Tudor period. However, it also reveals the influence of Art Nouveau in its use of curvilinear tracery in the windows. Clayton Greene had travelled in Belgium, where Art Nouveau originated. Here we can see that the overall shape of the window is derived from the late Gothic or Tudor style of architecture, but we can also see how sinuous and expressive the tracery is. Again, inspired by Art Nouveau. St Gabriel's Church was originally intended to have a short tower and spire, but these were never built due to financial restrictions. Domestic architecture was a focus of Clayton Greene's work, and he was much influenced by Sir Edwin Lutyens, the arts and crafts designer. Hamerton Hall in Grey Road is essentially an arts and crafts villa. It was particularly inspired by Edgar Wood's design for Upmeads in Stafford of 1906. Both buildings feature a concave facade with a vertical strip of masonry to emphasize the entrance. The design of Hamerton Hall has an arts and crafts simplicity with thick stone mullions to the windows above the entrance, a brick chimney, and an expressive wooden porch. Unlike Upmeads, the outer wings are built at right angles to each other, which was perhaps inspired by a house called the Barn, designed by Edward Pryor at Exmouth in Devon. Clayton Greene was certainly aware of Pryor's work because there is evidence that he was inspired by Pryor's design for St Andrew's Church at Roker. As we move into the Roaring Twenties, The glitzy Art Deco style swept the world. The most surprising example in Sunderland is the former synagogue of 1928, built on Ryop Road. Migrations from Holland and Germany during the 18th century gave Sunderland a substantial Jewish community. The synagogue was built at a cost of £11,000 and was designed by the architect Marcus Kenneth Glass of Newcastle, who was born Yekuzio Glas in Riga, Latvia, but arrived in Newcastle as a toddler in the 1890s. Historically, there was no definitive architectural style for synagogues. Such buildings tended to emulate indigenous traditions to aid assimilation. Working in a climate of relative tolerance, however, Glass developed a unique approach to synagogue design, combining the ancient Byzantine style with the modern Art Deco style more familiar from cinemas. The brick arches and luminous mosaics recall ancient Byzantine forms, but the rectilinear and geometric tracery within the windows suggest the influence of Art Deco, as unlikely as that sounds. Below the window is a brilliant turquoise mosaic bearing a Hebrew scripture from the Bible, Numbers 24:5, which reads, Ma tovu ochalecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Israel, which means, how goodly are thy tents, O Jacob, thy dwelling places, O Israel. Above the window is a traditional luchot, or tablet representing the Ten Commandments, made in this case of artificial stone, a common building material at the time. A treasure of Jewish heritage, the synagogue represents one of the last optimistic expressions of European Judaism before the tragedy of the Holocaust. In 1964, Sunderland County Borough commissioned Sir Basil Spence Bonington and Collins to design a new civic centre on the rocky outcrop known as Building Hill. It was conceived as a democratic building, making the operations of local government more accessible to citizens. However, its abstract design struggled to communicate with the public. John S. Bonington was the project architect. He studied at Durham University and gained experience on town planning projects in the USA. With reference to Sunderland Civic Centre, he said, I have always wanted to design a building of consequence in the Northeast. This is a rare photograph showing Sir Basil Spence with Jack Bonington inspecting a model of Sunderland Civic Centre, ironically within the building it would replace, Sunderland Town Hall. Construction was completed at a cost of £3,359,000. John Ling Construction was the contractor, and Sir Ovi Arup and Partners acted as structural consultants. The building consisted of two hexagonal rings connected by a four-storey core. Each had a landscaped courtyard at the centre, and the rings were supported by powerful concrete columns, which allowed the non-load-bearing walls within to be reconfigured if necessary, making the internal spaces flexible. The centre responded to its topography in the manner advocated by the great American architect Frank Lloyd Wright, echoing the natural rock strata of Building Hill and stepping down the slope. This gave it the character of a geological formation rather than an architectural monument, an impression compounded by the consistent use of materials inside and out, making it, in its way, a modest building that sought to blend in. Linking the terraces, a series of artfully designed steps and ramps cascaded down to street level. However, the monochromatic surfaces made them confusing and dangerous, although they were heated to prevent freezing in winter. The entire centre was clad in a modest material palette of brindled engineering bricks and tiles, all with a purplish sheen. The same materials were used internally, creating a synergy between interior and exterior. This aspect was probably inspired by Seinäjoki Town Hall in Finland, designed by the renowned Finnish architect Alvar Aalto, which was faced with similar bricks internally and externally. The Civic Suite was distinguished by an innovative chandelier, an asymmetrical lattice of hexagons in polished steel. This is just visible in this photograph. Beyond lay the superb council chamber, a hexagonal sanctum lined with brick and enclosed by a ceiling of Colombian pine rising to a skylit apex. When the building opened, firms that had provided materials and fittings advertised their contributions, and these adverts are useful as historical records. The building won the Duke of Edinburgh's Design Prize in 1973, although when Derek Clark of the Design Council visited to set up the ceremony, he broke his nose by walking into the glass doors. A spokesman said their design was a bit too modern for him. In conclusion, Sunderland's architecture has broadly followed the same patterns as comparable provincial towns, but it has produced some significant buildings and curiosities which are worthy of note. It's important that we recognise their value in order to safeguard their future.